So we started this class, I said it was really about natural history. And we've talked a lot about the nature part of natural history, and that was my intent, that really we spent a lot of our time talking about the plants, the wildlife that exist here in Washington State. But now it's time to turn to the history part of things and understand sort of the backstory. How did all this arrive? Every culture has its own creation myth. And by myth, I mean an account of sort of the history of the people and the places around them. I don't mean some sort of fake story. And scientists are going to have their own creation myth. We've limited ours in science to what we can basically tell through the lens of nature, just through natural laws in the physical universe. So it's a different sort of creation myth of sorts. Human life is fleeting when you look at it on a long enough time scale, right? A human life in geologic history, and that's where I want to take us into this long, deep history, is kind of like, one word on one page out of this entire bookshelf that's 16 feet long. So it's so small. As we get older, we have a different perspective on time. Do you remember when you were little and 5 minutes, if your mom or dad told you to wait 5 minutes, it seemed like an eternity? My wife tells a story that when she was little and they'd bake cookies, she thought, boy, this just took forever. And she just couldn't wrap her mind around it when she got older and made them herself. With 10 minutes? That's it? That's all it took? I could have sworn it took an hour. And so our perspective changes as we get older. So we're going to kind of borrow the history perspective from geology, from the earth itself, this really long history that's almost incomprehensible to us. We've talked about it a little bit when it comes to trees. They can be 1,000 years old. And so they see history, if they could perceive it the way we do, very, very differently. And even more so with the land itself. Concentrating just on Washington State, it helps to understand a little bit of the history here. It's different than a lot of the rest of the world, certainly different than a lot of the rest of North America. It has a pretty dynamic and young history. Hasn't been here, most of the state, for really all that long. We were pretty much underwater or non-existent until about 250 million years ago. And when I say we're taking a deep view of history, that goes back, scientists tell us, and this is beyond my sort of reckoning and understanding, over 3 billion years. And we're really only taking on, when I have you looking at some of the geologic time frame, the last 500 million years. And so we're really taking on even just a smaller piece of that. So, Washington wasn't here 250 million years ago. Dinosaurs were roaming around in our state, the land beneath your feet. It was just starting to actually form. So even before that, in other parts of the United States, there are these huge forests of fern-like plants, a lot of them like giant horsetails. We looked at the horsetail plant. Well, those used to be giant trees with trunks like this, and those fell down in swamps and formed coal, which today powers a lot of our electricity, even here in Washington State. So when you turn on a light switch, then really that energy to power the lights or anything else in your house, the computer that you're probably watching this on, that energy came from the sun, captured by plants that have been extinct for millions of years. It's just really kind of an interesting way of looking at the world. First off, when we talk about evolution, I think it's really pretty helpful to define what it is. And evolution, despite the silly movie cover here, is really just a change over time within a population. So any sort of genetic change over multiple generations is it. So it doesn't have to be anything huge. And we'll take things on a big scale and a small scale. But this is actually pretty different than the question of origins. Origins have to do with where did it all come from, starting with the universe itself. So Big Bang Theory sometimes gets wrapped up with evolution, but it has really nothing to do with it. That's how the universe got here. Important questions, but really way outside of our purview. There's also the question of the origin of life. One theory that's pretty well accepted has to do with these kind of clay mats. This one's from Yellowstone National Park and shows a variety of interesting bacteria on clay. And people think that maybe different biomolecules formed and organized themselves using some of the chemical properties of clay. It seems very plausible and whatnot, but it also is pretty far outside of our purview in this class, where we're really just looking at how did life change once it started. Different people have different opinions on this one, and some scientists think that life actually came from outer space on asteroids and got down to Earth, which then just begs the question, well, where did it come from before that? Which is actually kind of the topic of this rather funny movie. But all that aside, what we're going to limit ourselves to is this idea over here on the right, this idea of tree of life, that we'll just kind of take for granted that life started at some point. We're not going to concern ourselves how down here at the base of the tree. And then as time progressed, a great deal of time, then different organisms diversified from those simple first organisms, and you got a whole branch of this tree being the plants, a rather large trunk and branch are the animals. They're a very diverse group. And then you have some protists and others, often other branches of this tree. And we've talked about that idea a little bit before. So that's the idea we're going to take on. Let's set aside the idea of origins and just get to how does life change from the scientific perspective. People didn't always think that life changed for quite a bit of time, and I will kind of add right away here, this is a strictly Western view, Western European view, which is kind of where science starts. And there's a huge amount of diversity in other cultures and places. But given that this is a science class, we're going to take that view, but I think that perspective is important. So in Western thought, the world was pretty static, that it's always been the way it is, it always will be the way it is, and very little changes. Well, starting with the Renaissance and some of those ideas, people started taking a different look at the world, and in the 1800s started to make some big progress here. Charles Lyell, studying geology mainly, saw these different strata, these layers of rock, and said, I don't think they just happened to be there. I think these represent layers that have been laid down over time, that you get older layers on the bottom and then newer ones were laid on top of them. And he started looking at fossils, like these guys you can barely see in the picture are probably doing, digging around looking at evidence of previous life. And when they do that, they see, hey, these fossils change. The stuff down here in these lower layers is different than the stuff in the upper layers. And sometimes I find the old stuff in newer layers somewhere else, and sometimes it's just gone by the time it gets, it exists from kind of down here to up here, and then I never see it again. And that's how we know animals have gone extinct. So that was a pretty influential idea on a lot of scientists, including Charles Darwin. Lamarck was trying to make sense of the world in the early 1800s and proposed this idea that was also influential on Darwin, and he really kind of had this same sort of idea. And that's the idea of change based on need. So you acquired these traits through time. Remember, this was before modern genetics because you needed them. So this early giraffe couldn't quite reach these branches or had a trouble doing so, and so it developed this longer neck. And so its offspring then had a longer neck, which, as need arose, grew even longer, and the next generation had a longer neck still. It's a nice idea and persisted for quite a long time. But when you think about it, well, why not say that, if this giraffe had its leg amputated, then it would have a bunch of three-legged offspring. That doesn't really make sense and doesn't fit in with modern genetics, but it was still a move in the right direction, this idea that species can change through time and that young can inherit those traits, even if they didn't get it exactly right. So a lot of thought went into the idea of species changing around this time. What was the scientists' evidence that life changed? Well, science is all about evidence, right? So there better be something showing that life changed over time that we can point to and everybody can observe, not just be speculation. So one of those is fossils. We can see in the rocks traces of old plant and animal life, even some microscopic life. And you can see that in some of the different rock structures here. Some are abundantly clear and others are a little more obscure, like this guy over here looks like an old mushroom or maybe a simple plant of some sort, while this nice full skeleton is pretty clear evidence of something that swam in the sea with these flippers and all that. Others is a bit more obscure. This is a coprolite, which is fossilized poop. Kind of a strange one to think about, but certainly shows that there was life back in that day and age. There are some fossils that kind of make it into modern life. And some species have gone extinct, but some we still have with us, and these are kind of important bridge species. And the ginkgo is one of these. You may have one planted in your yard. They have really distinctive fan-shaped leaves. And in Washington State, we also have the ginkgo petrified forest. We can find fossils of those ginkgo leaves, and those are really pretty clear. You look at that and say, yeah, that didn't just form from some sort of crystalline structures in the rock. It wasn't erosion. That clearly looks like one of these leaves over here. And these plants are kind of interesting. They are a gymnosperm, but not a conifer. They have male and female trees. Male trees produce the pollen and the female the seeds. And they're deciduous tree as well. This plant, although this is not a great map, used to exist all over the Pacific Northwest. Find fossils of it throughout Europe and find quite a few through Japan, it looks like, as well. But the only existing ones are in this small little river valley in China. And that's the only place they're native. Now they've been planted elsewhere as ornamental trees. But when we look back on the fossil record, that's what we find. And so it's kind of a nice current evidence that this species does exist. We know what it is. We can see it and touch it and see the living structures, but we also see the fossils. So kind of an interesting one that we have a special monument for within our state. We can also draw evidence from existing animals. And we've talked about this one before with locomotion. And what we call the similarities in the bone structures are homologous. And there's lots of different homologous structures, not only the forelimbs, but quite a few others. Even internally, we have a digestive system, and that's similar to that of a horse or a cow or an elk or a bear. And they didn't reinvent the digestive system custom for every single species. And the idea here is this is evidence that we share a common ancestor because we have similar parts. They've just been rearranged over time through the changes in genetic material, especially the so-called master genes that control development plans. And so we've been over this before, but again, the idea that this purple bone here, the humerus, you find in a turtle and a dolphin and a human and a horse, a bird and a bat, and a similar structure throughout is probably more than coincidence. And nothing in not one bit of evidence proves anything is true, but it's certainly evidence for it, and I hope that you can see that that idea is at least consistent with the notion that species came from a common ancestor. This can be taken even to the next level in what we call vestigial structures. Structures that don't really have a current use, but they still exist. And the idea is they exist because our ancestors had them. And so this also brings up some really interesting scientific debates as well that'll bring up here for a moment. So the coccyx, your tailbone, right? We call it the tailbone for a reason. It looks like a tail. If we're related to other primates, then their backbone extends and would form the tail out the back. And ours is just kind of this shriveled, withered up little bit of a tail that doesn't even stick out and help us balance or grasp on trees. So we call it vestigial. Doesn't do anything for us. Now, others would argue it's not vestigial. We actually have bones or muscles that attach to those bones, like some of our glutes, and so it's not useless at all. It just has a different purpose. Fair point. There, in some whales, you see a fossilized ankle bone, and this extinct whale, but you also see some back feet kind of hanging off of the whales that don't seem to do anything because they've just lost their back legs altogether. You even see this in some boa constrictors. They'll have leg bones in certain parts of their spine. One of the other interesting ones that, and I can't speak to whether those have another use or not, one that's kind of near to me is the appendix. So in your intestines, you have this little part called the appendix, and that's argued that that's a vestigial structure. And so we know that you have your esophagus comes down into your stomach, and your stomach coils into all these small intestines, and then your large intestine loops around like this and eventually comes out. But there's this little tiny structure here that hangs down called the appendix, and sometimes that fills up like mine did, and you get infected, and it can burst open and be dangerous. It doesn't seem to really do much for us other than sometimes cause problems. And so a lot of people will argue that the appendix is a vestigial structure. It doesn't do anything, and it certainly looks like kind of a shrunken up version of what you might find in a horse, which is a much larger fermentation chamber that holds lots of bacteria. Others say, no, it's not vestigial at all. It actually is this kind of little pocket off of the large intestines. One of the things we need in our large intestines is bacteria to colonize this whole area and help us digest our food. But if we got something unpleasant like diarrhea that sort of washed out our bacteria, or modern days more, we took antibiotics, wouldn't it be nice to have this little reservoir of bacteria held in a little pouch off to the side? And so, again, a different argument using the same evidence, you can see things different ways. More just a commentary on science there than anything else. Along with homologous structures, we can also see some homology or similarities within the molecular information that we have. This can be DNA, or it can be proteins that are made using information in DNA. So here we have 3 different strips of DNA, or of proteins, sorry. These little 3-letter abbreviations stand for each amino acid within that. And these are 3 different species, and we can look at that and see where things are the same, where they're yellow, and these little strips of green are where they're different. And so there's a lot of this stretch in here where it's mostly the same, and the protein functions mostly the same, but there are some differences within that. Even the sort of beginning segment is more different than the same, but within the heart of the protein here, the core of it, we have these little differences, meaning that the protein is going to work slightly differently. And as you might expect, these do mirror those physical similarities. Species that look more alike tend to have more similar DNA and proteins. The more different they are, then the more different the protein and DNA. We often use mice as research subjects because most of their DNA is the same as ours. And so they work about the same as we do. There are obvious differences, but there are more similarities than there are differences, even on a molecular level. Then last line of evidence is biogeography. And just to dissect this a little bit, the geography, where things are on the planet, and looking at where life is, we see that different organisms tend to develop similar forms in similar habitats. So this is a nice example. These are all ratites, large flightless birds. Probably familiar with the ostrich, lives in dry grassland areas of Africa. Probably less familiar with this guy down here, the rhea, but it lives in grassland areas in South America. And so both of these look a lot alike, and the idea is they have both evolved to this form because it's a good advantage within that habitat. Even this one, you're probably a little more familiar with, the emu in Australia. Again, grassland habitat, really open, and although flight might be an advantage, so are powerful legs that they can run very fast with. There's another one even, there are several species of moa that existed, otherwise known as elephant birds. This is just an artist's depiction of them. They went extinct, I want to say just a few hundred years ago in New Zealand when they were hunted to extinction, because it's a pretty small area. But there was another sort of similar looking bird there. Then one other example would be camels and llamas and alpacas and vicuñas. So going along with the idea of plate tectonics, these continents drifted apart, and South America and Africa had once been together, and then they drifted apart. And so these animals drifted apart. And we find the camel still over in Asia and Africa, and then we find the camel's cousin over in South America, the llamas and alpacas and vicuñas. And they have a lot of similarities, but they have adapted to very different environments. So it kind of tells a slightly different story than some of the ratites. These guys were the same, or at least came from the same ancestor, but eventually evolved into very different looking species with different specializations and adaptations because of the different environments. Which brings up an important point about common ancestry. It wasn't as though you had a camel that then, some ended up in South America and some in Africa. You had something that looked a little bit like a camel, and something that looked a little bit like a vicuña, and something that looked a little bit like an alpaca, but it wasn't any of those. It was an ancestor. And then as time went on, certain adaptations won out, and they ended up looking the way they do today.